All right, welcome everyone to the Great Charities podcast. And today we are, as always, here for a treat, but this treat is a bit tastier than normally, especially for me, and I will explain why in a second. I'm here with Mahi Klosterhafen. He works for the Mike, can you help me? Schweitzer Foundation?
Yeah, Albert Schweitzer Foundation.
Albert Schweitzer Foundation. You probably never heard that it's a tricky name to pronounce before, right?
Yeah, for us Germans, it's super easy, but for anybody else, it might not.
Gotcha. And of course, a tricky name translates to a very efficient organization. The Albert Schweitzer Foundation have received a $1.6 million grant from the Open Philanthropy Project for their work to prevent damage done to broiler chickens. And they've also been ranked as the #1 organization that is helping animals 2 years in a row from animal charity evaluators. These are, if you're not new to this field, 2 huge accomplishments in my world. And I quickly want to share why I'm so excited to speak with you guys today. And that is because my heart question in the field of charity is animal welfare. And that is where I personally make my donations to. And since you guys are the top ranked cause, you are, out of all organizations in the world, you guys are who I will choose to make my charity donations to.
So that's super kind. May I jump in just 1 second?
Yes, of course.
So just to clarify, we are one of 4 top recommendations. So there are 3 other great groups, and actually many other great groups around the world where donations can do quite a lot of good in the animal charity field.
And that is the kind of humbleness that can only be spoken from someone that is ranked #1 out of those 4. Man, I'm super excited to have you here. And the purpose of this podcast is to explain what great organizations do in a way that is easy to understand. So could you explain what your foundation is doing as simple as possible?
Sure. So, well, at the first glance, we are an animal charity group. So we do help animals. And actually starting out, we were helping all sorts of animals. We even joined protests to ban wild animals from circuses, etc. And we soon realized that we have to focus in order to really get things done. And when we saw that, we quickly decided to focus on factory farming, because by far, when you look at all the areas where humans cause damage, hurt, death to animals, factory farming is by far the #1 cause in terms of numbers of animals involved. And I think also you could argue the suffering is very intense in factory farms. So that's where we decided to focus. And even in that area of factory farming, we decided to focus very much in order to really have an impact. And we started out with working on ending battery cages in Germany. Because
what kind of cages?
Battery cages, so the very small cages that are absolutely barren, nothing in there, just cages and nothing else. And like feeding goes in and the eggs come out, and the animals don't matter at all. They're just egg producing machines. So we were able, since this is a very brief introduction, we were able to end battery cages basically in Germany. And we now are focusing on other species, such as broiler chickens, as you mentioned, but also fishes who are kind of not on the radar when it comes to animal welfare that much.
Wow. How many lives of chickens do you think have been improved because of this action?
So in Germany, we usually have around 40 million chickens living at any given point of time. And when I started working for the foundation back in, I think that was 2008 or 2009, 90% of these were in cages. Our founder had already achieved a big victory in front of the German Constitutional Court, which ruled battery cages as unconstitutional. However, all the big buyers, like all the supermarket chains and all the catering operations, they were still able to import cage eggs from neighboring countries, for instance. So this win, as important as it was not really there to stop this practice. So when I joined in, my first mission was to convince the German supermarket chains to stop selling these eggs, which kind of worked right away. And so it's kind of safe to say that now north of 30 million chickens per year are affected by the work that we as a foundation have done. But I have to add, often in collaboration with other groups. So it's not like I did this personally or the foundation did this by itself. So you always have to keep that in mind.
Mm. So what is the process then to initiate those changes? Is it political work? Is it activism? Is it handing out flyers, raising awareness?
Yeah, great question. So this is also a question we asked ourselves very often, and we tried all kinds of things. The German animal protection movement before Albert Schweitzer Foundation really got going was very much focused on convincing consumers to stop buying battery cage eggs. So they would have like leaflets and flyers and maybe online ads or whatever saying, please choose cage-free eggs. So eggs that come from production systems that are not as bad as battery cages, but that only had a tiny impact. So we figured out that legal work can be extremely helpful, so convincing the courts to ban certain practices. And also corporate outreach is hugely impactful, because when you convince a supermarket chain to stop selling certain products, you don't have to convince the consumers anymore because they don't have a choice. It's just not there anymore. And usually they won't go to a different country just to find certain eggs. So kind of we take these choices away for consumers. We just convince the big buyers to change their behavior, and then the worst animal products aren't available anymore.
Mm. So is there something you think the average European or American citizen don't know about your cause as a whole that you would like for them to know?
Yes, so the average person in the US, I often heard, is not very aware of factory farming. So at least several years ago, it used to be the case when I last checked in that many people just had the impression that farm animals are treated kind of in a nice way, and they live in small farms and they can jump around the backyard, etc., which is unfortunately not the case. Like the average animal product you buy, be it meat or eggs or any dairy products, comes from these factory farms, these huge operations where many animals are crammed into very crowded spaces, where they don't have really many enrichments, sometimes no enrichments at all, so they can't really do anything. And like any other animal, like a dog or a cat, they want to keep busy, they want to actually enjoy life, but there's no way for them to do that in factory farms. In fact, disease rates are very high in these farms, a lot of antibiotic use to even keep the animals alive, so they won't die before they reach their purpose, which is being slaughtered or laying many eggs or giving a lot of milk maybe. So this is unfortunately the situation we are facing all across the world. In some countries like Switzerland, people tend to think that factory farming has been abandoned, which is unfortunately not the case. So 99% of animal production is unfortunately really horrible, so bad actually that you don't want to watch the videos probably that some activists
99%, wow.
Yeah, that's pretty much the ratio.
Yeah, me myself, it hurts when I see those images. I can barely make myself, I just know how bad it is, but it creates so much suffering for me to watch the images. So I guess that's a challenge you guys are facing when reaching out to people. I mean, just looking at myself, when I was a teenager, I wanted to help animals in some way. So I gave some small donations to causes that was helping elephants, for example, because I felt resonance with that animal. And at the same time, I think probably not that many people relate to chickens. So how can you make people care about chickens?
It's difficult. It really is. I mean, Germans have in polls always said that they won't buy eggs from battery caged hens. Unfortunately, the market data showed that these statements were kind of false, unfortunately. But we had, like, through these undercover investigations and through the media picking up on these and kind of airing the stories and showing people how farm animals have to live, we can get a shift in kind of acceptance in what is seen as acceptable by most people on the streets, basically. And so fortunately, this does include chickens. So people did say that they were not happy with the way hens were treated in these battery cages. And also when you undercover investigations about broiler chickens, so the chickens that get slaughtered for their meat, when these investigations come out, there's also an outrage. So people do seem to care on some level, but I think it's not really possible to make them empathize as much as they would empathize with a dog or a cat, unless they actually get to meet some animals, which you can at some farm sanctuaries, for instance.
Gotcha. So you're saying now you're working more towards broiler chickens, and could you explain the difference between them and cage hens?
Yes, so it's very interesting when you look at a hen or oh, sorry, I forgot to mute my phone. I'll do that right away. When you look at the way chickens are used, they used to be used as both purposes, dual purpose, so to speak. So they were used for their eggs, and then after some times they were slaughtered for their meat. And then kind of when factory farming came into play, the farmers and the breeders, they were always looking for ways to make things more efficient. So they figured out that they can breed an animal, especially for laying hens, for laying eggs. So these animals, these laying hens, they lay around 300 eggs per year, sometimes even more. So almost 1 egg per day, which is completely unnatural for them to do. In nature, they would lay maybe, I don't know, 6 eggs and then kind of raise the chicks that come out of these eggs. But in factory farming and in the breeding techniques that were used over time, they now lay almost 1 egg per day. But these chickens, they don't grow fat very fast. Actually, they are not made to grow fat very fast, so they can live a little bit longer. So they can be used for laying eggs for over a year. On the other hand, you have the broiler chickens, which are used for their meat, and they are bred to grow extremely fast and extremely fat, extremely fast. So it takes them about a month to reach their slaughter weight, at least in Germany. So kind of you could, if you make the comparison to a human being, which I know is a difficult thing to make, but you could basically say that a baby becomes kind of a sumo wrestler within just a couple of years. It's so fast that these chickens grow. It's like really extreme. And so we have 2 completely different breeds that still both called chickens, but they kind of function in a very different way for the industries.
I didn't know that it was that different. Wow, I think few people are aware of that.
Yeah,
it's my guess.
Yeah.
So you received a $1.6 million grant from the Open Philanthropy Project, and that is to help broiler chickens. What is a really good thing you think that could happen realistically in the next years?
Yes, first to clarify, so Open Philanthropy kind of decided after a while of funding certain parts of our work, like cage-free work or broiler work or fish work. They kind of decided to give us an upgrade in terms of giving us an unrestricted grant. So they are basically now saying, here's money, do what you think is best for the animals. And after working together with Open Philanthropy Project for a couple of years, and when they're happy with the progress they see, sometimes they will decide to give you like these unrestricted funds. So now we can kind of decide what exactly we want to do with the money. And one thing we do with the money is working on broilers, as you mentioned. And what happened is that several animal protection groups all across Europe sat together and decided, what do we want to ask the industry to do? And that was an extremely important step because for laying hens, it's relatively easy. You ask companies to stop using eggs that come from these terrible cages. And with broilers, there is not really kind of a different way to differentiate between standards, because you have like standard factory farming, and then you usually have organic, which is twice as expensive or 3 times as expensive, and which is not really a way to go if you want to convince businesses to change their ways of operating. So what happened? These groups came together and we thought about what are the most terrible things that happen to broiler chickens. One of them we already talked about. It's called overbreeding. They just grow way too fast. And that leads to them actually not really being able to walk when it comes close to their slaughtering day. So they actually, because they grew so heavy, so fast, the legs can't even carry the bodies anymore. And that leads to some of them actually dying because they can't move to where the water or where the feed is anymore. So that's only a small percentage. Most of them obviously survive for economic reasons alone. This is made sure by the industry. But we want to make sure this overbreeding is at least slowed down so it's not as terrible anymore for the animals. And the second part is the space they're given. So we want to improve the space per bird. Right now they are cramped next to each other, and it's basically around 25 birds per square meter. So you can't see much when you look from the top and you look on all these birds. You can't really see the floor because it's just birds. And we decided to ask in a reduction of stocking density. So we have fewer birds per square meter, which is very important. And then we also are asking for a couple of enrichments, such as they get some material they can play or engage with, which is important for the animals. We want higher air quality and more light, which is important to make them move more. If they're just kept in dark all the time, they don't really move a lot, and then they can convert even more feed into meat because they don't use the calories for moving around. So it's really, unfortunately, terrible what the industry comes up with. So we're asking for more light and some other small improvements. And that is now what we're asking companies to do, to commit to changing their chicken supply to these higher standards.
All right. So instead of trying to make industries and people switch to organic chicken, you are trying to make the conditions better for the broiler chickens. So the suffering is at least a little bit less.
That's right. And just to note, organic, like people, when they hear organic, they think it's a paradise for animals. Unfortunately, when you Google, like for undercover investigations that have been done in organic farms, you will see that it's absolutely not the case. So organic is unfortunately not the solution for people who want to have happy animals, for instance, happy meat.
Got it. That leads me nicely into the last question, because we're coming up towards the end here. And that is, if someone feels called towards being involved in making the lives of factory farm animals better, what is something they can do to be involved and engaged and help?
So when it comes to personal choices, there are several things. One is obviously giving money, giving donations to charities that help ending the worst practices. And if you're totally new to this, you might want to check out animal charity evaluators for some recommendations. And then obviously there are personal choices everybody can make. And for me personally, 15 years ago, I've decided not only to stop eating meat, but to stop eating all animal products. So I'm totally on a plant-based diet for 15 years. It has been working very well for me. If some listeners say, wow, this step is way too big for me, I just encourage everybody to take this step by step and to look for online resources on how this can be done. There are a lot of guides on how to switch to a more plant-based diet or even go all the way. And that's really the speed and the extent to which you want to do this really depends on where you are in your life, basically.
Mahi, it was a lot of fun speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time for this interview.
It's been a pleasure, Emil. Thank you very much.
Good luck with your work.
Thanks.